The British government has turned down an appeal from Labour Lord Peter Hain for the UK to back the establishment of an international anti-corruption court. Lord Hain has championed this to hold accountable those involved in things like money laundering activities, which wipe off an estimated 5% of global GDP. It seems to be that there is wide support for such a court, including amongst BRICS countries. But the House of Lords, while saying that it was fully committed to ensuring that those who commit egregious acts of corruption are held to account, the time was not right now for such an institution. Lord Hain has previously campaigned against corruption, persuading the Conservative government to ban US-based consultancy Bain & Co. from doing business with the British government for a 3-year period because of its complicity in state capture. And that ban, we understand, has now been lifted early. Lord Peter Hain joins us now. Peter, good evening to you and welcome. You are disappointed by what's happened in the House of Lords. Why?
Yes, I was. Not totally surprised, frankly, because it's a new idea to establish an international corruption court. And it came to me originally from South Africa, when Judge Richard Goldstone and others, Coogan Pillay, who formerly served on the president's team, and various other important figures in South Africa asked me to press the case for an international corruption court, which is what I've started to do. It is also supported, by the way, by Judge Wolfson in America. So there are pressures in the US for it to be established too. And the problem, Iman, is this. There is an international criminal court to tackle war criminals and genocide, those responsible for genocide and other war crimes. But there's nothing to tackle the problem of international corruption and money laundering. And as you know, with the Gupta brothers linked to former President Zuma, I mean, they're still free. None of their assets have been returned to South Africa. And I think a court like this would help catch people like them.
Well, let's also telescope out of the South African example, which, as you know, still burns for us. But the OECD estimates that, illicit financial flows from Africa are valued at around $50 to $60 billion of a loss every year. And it includes things like tax evasion, corruption, money laundering, and the funding of terrorism. So this is a huge problem, isn't it?
It's a massive problem for Africa, and South Africa has a terrible dose of it through state capture, and some of it's still continuing, frankly. It hasn't been stopped in its entirety. But across the world, it's a big problem too. Around $2 trillion US, or 5% of the world's entire wealth is money laundered each and every year. I mean, that's a prodigious amount. It's bigger than a whole lot of African countries' GDP, their national wealth all put together. And it continues year after year. So governments like the British, the Americans, the Indians, the Chinese, and so on, all say they're against all of this. But in practice, then they're turning a blind eye. And it goes through London, it goes through Beijing, it goes through Hong Kong above all, it goes through Dubai, and the United Arab Emirates is very involved in it, and nothing is done. So the advantage of having an international anti-corruption court, and I hope the South African government will back it, and the president will too, even if the British government's not been persuaded yet. They didn't say no to me. They simply said in rather weasel words that they hadn't been persuaded that there were enough people supporting it. Well, I wanted them to get out front. But until this is backed by all the governments, then we're not going to catch these international criminals and money law.
We may not have time to go back to what the Deputy Foreign Minister in the UK, Tariq Ahmed, had to say about existing measures to deal with things, to deal with this type of problem. But how would this work? How would this court, how do you envisage it working?
Well, a bit like the International Criminal Court, there would be a jurisdiction. The ICC's in The Hague, where it goes would be a matter for international agreement, an international United Nations treaty. So it'd become international law. And then the advantage would be that even if the countries where these criminals and money launderers were holed up were not signed up, then at least if they traveled, they could be, and they traveled into a jurisdiction which was signed up, they could then be arrested and prosecuted and brought to justice. So they'd start to find the heat was on them. They may have smuggled their laundered assets out of Africa, for example, and try to hide them, as the Guptas have done and various other people have done. But they couldn't escape the reach of international law if they decided to move around or if they established companies, as many have done in other jurisdictions which were signed up. So I think it'll be a big step forward and also a deterrent to this gigantic money laundering and corruption from which South Africa has suffered so grievously.
So what's the next move going to be, Peter?
Well, we'll continue to campaign. I'm liaising with campaigners in the United States of America. I'm keeping in touch with those like Judge Richard Goldstone in South Africa, and we'll keep up the momentum. We're not going to give up. I think this is winnable, even if in the House of Lords last week, the government minister, said that he couldn't proceed. He didn't give a flat no, and that's encouraging. And there are half a dozen countries, including Canada and Ecuador and Nigeria, which are already signed up to this, and a lot of prominent people, Nobel laureates, former presidents, former prime ministers, right across the world as well. So there's a gathering momentum, and I hope that people in South Africa, politicians, as well as civil society campaigners, will support it too. So let's keep fighting for it.
Peter, thanks for your time tonight. We appreciate it. That has been Labour Lord Peter Hain, who is talking to us there about the establishment of an international anti-corruption court.